It was one of those gray afternoons in downtown Cincinnati, the kind where the sky threatened rain, but never quite delivered. The air was thick with a familiar scent of damp pavement, gasoline, and distant fast food, a mix of the city's pulse and its quiet neglect. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks with the usual rhythm, some rushing to their destinations, some lost in their own world, and others just trying to make it through another day. Among them was JD Vance, walking with a steady pace, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He wasn't wearing a suit, no entourage, no flashing cameras, just another man blending into the city. But even in casual clothes, people noticed him. Some stole quick glances, whispering as they passed. They recognized him, maybe from TV appearances, maybe from the headlines. His name carried weight. But in this moment, he wasn't a politician, just a guy walking past old storefronts, dodging the occasional scooter abandoned on the sidewalk. Then, a voice broke through the city's noise. "Hey, man, can you spare $1?" Vance barely had time to process the request before his steps slowed. It wasn't the first time he'd heard those words. Over the years, he had walked past countless street corners where men and women asked for change, some with outstretched hands, some with weary eyes, some with signs that told stories too heavy for words. But something about this voice, the way it wavered slightly, the way it carried both familiarity and exhaustion, made him pause. He turned, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on the man standing just a few feet away. The man was thin, but not just in the way hunger wears someone down. It was the kind of thin that hollowed out the cheeks, made the eyes look bigger, made the clothes seem just a little too loose. His layers of mismatched clothing weren't chosen for fashion. They were chosen for survival. His beard was patchy, his hands cracked from exposure, but it was his expression that caught Vance's attention. There was no desperation, no aggression, no expectation, just a quiet, almost practiced patience, like he'd asked this 1,000 times before, like he already knew the answer. Vance stopped. "What's your name?" The man blinked, momentarily thrown off. That wasn't how this was supposed to go. Usually, people either dropped the bill into his palm or walked away. He hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Eddie," he muttered. Vance studied him for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Around them, people kept walking, barely noticing. To them, this was just another exchange between two people who existed in entirely different worlds. But there was something about Eddie that kept Vance planted where he stood. "You live around here?" Eddie let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I live wherever I can. You know how it is." Vance nodded, but didn't immediately reach for his wallet. Instead, he asked, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie shifted on his feet, glancing toward the street, like he was debating whether to answer or just walk away. For a moment, it seemed like he might do just that. Then, finally, he exhaled. "Too long," he said. "If this moment has already pulled you in, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. The next part of this story is about to take an unexpected turn. You won't want to miss it." It wasn't the first time JD Vance had heard those words. He'd spent enough time in cities like this to recognize the rhythm of street requests, the way some people asked with urgency, others with practiced attachment, and some, like Eddie, with a quiet resignation of someone who no longer expected much. Usually, these encounters followed a script, a brief exchange, a bill handed over, a polite shake of the head, and then life moved on. But something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way Eddie's voice wavered. Maybe it was the way he didn't immediately make eye contact. Maybe it was just one of those moments where instinct overruled routine. Vance didn't walk away. Instead, he asked again, "How long have you been out here?" Eddie hesitated. His body language shifted, like someone deciding whether to let his guard down or brush the question off. There was a long pause, long enough that Vance could hear the faint hum of traffic from the intersection nearby, the footsteps of pedestrians passing by, the occasional buzz of phone notification from someone checking their messages. Finally, Eddie exhaled. Too long. His voice carried something beyond exhaustion, something heavier, something that lingered. Vance studied him. Eddie was thin, but not just in the way hunger wears someone down. His clothes, mismatched layers, threadbare to edges, weren't chosen for fashion, but for survival. His beard was uneven, more neglected than intentional, and his hands, cracked, rough from the cold, told the story of someone who had been fighting a quiet battle for years. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Not just tired, distant, guarded, the kind of eyes that had learned not to expect kindness. Vance could have just handed him $1 and walked away. It would have been easy. It would have been expected. Instead, he asked, "What would you do with it?" Eddie blinked as if caught off guard. "What?" $1, Vance clarified. "What would you do with it?" For the first time, Eddie looked at him directly, and then he let out a short laugh. Not a bitter one, not mocking, just surprised. Man, ain't that the question? But Vance didn't laugh. He wasn't joking. Eddie's expression shifted just slightly. He studied Vance now, as if trying to figure out if this was some kind of test. He shrugged. $1 don't get you much these days, he muttered. Maybe a coffee. Maybe a piece of bread, if you know where to go. A pause. Then quieter. Or maybe just a moment where I don't feel like nothing. The weight of his words settled between them. For the first time, the city noise felt quieter. The footsteps, the distant car horns, the chatter of strangers passing by. None of it mattered in that moment. Vance's jaw tightened. He had spent his life hearing stories like this. Stories of people who slipped through the cracks. People who once had something and lost it. People who woke up one day and realized they had nowhere left to go. It was easy to dismiss the problem when it was just another person on the street. But standing here, face to face, hearing in real time, that was different. You used to work? Vance asked. Eddie let out another laugh, though this one was emptier. Yeah, before life got in the way. Vance didn't look away. What was the job? Eddie hesitated, as if deciding whether it was even worth answering. Then finally he sighed. Plumber, not the fancy kind. Residential work mostly. Fix leaky pipes. Replace busted water heaters. He shook his head. Ain't much demand for a guy who don't got a fix address, though. And there it was. The unspoken truth. The cycle that kept people like Eddie trapped. No address, no job. No job, no money. No money, no way out. Vance had seen it before. Too many times. Eddie shrugged, his tone casual, but his eyes betrayed something else. Something raw. So, you gonna give me $1 or what? Another pause. Vance could feel eyes on him now. Someone had stopped nearby, maybe eavesdropping, maybe recording. He wasn't sure. But what he said next would change everything. I'll give you something better. Vance's words hung in the air. I'll give you something better. Eddie squinted at him, skeptical. Man, I ain't asking for a sermon. It's not a sermon, Vance said, his voice calm but unwavering. Eddie crossed his arms, shifting his weight. Around them, the city moved on. People walked by, barely noticing that something unexpected was unfolding on this ordinary stretch of sidewalk. But for Eddie, this wasn't ordinary. He had asked for money before, hundreds of times. He knew the usual responses. A quick handout, a polite refusal, a look of guilt, or worse, avoidance. But this wasn't following the script. Eddie exhaled, rubbing his hands together to fight the lingering cold in the air. All right then, he muttered. What's better than $1? Vance didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, when's the last time someone gave you a real shot? Eddie blinked. That question landed harder than expected. A shot, he echoed, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and something else, something unspoken. Like a real chance, Vance said. Not just a meal, not just a place to sleep for the night. I mean someone actually investing in you, believing in you, giving you the opportunity to pull yourself out of this. Eddie let out a short, humorless laugh. Man, I don't even remember. His voice was quieter now. Not because he didn't want to answer, because he didn't know how. For years, his life had been a cycle, waking up on a different sidewalk, waiting in line at shelters, searching for food, hoping no one would bother him too much. At some point, hope had just stopped feeling real. He glanced past Vance, looking toward the city like it held an answer somewhere in its towering skyline. Been a while, he admitted. Vance nodded, as if he already knew. He shoved his hands deeper into his jacket pockets, exhaling as he watched Eddie process the weight of the question. "You ever try to get off the streets?" Vance asked. Eddie scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, what kind of question is that?" Vance didn't flinch. Eddie's expression hardened. "You think I want to be out here? You think this is some kind of choice?" Vance didn't respond right away, because he wasn't here to argue. He was here to listen. Eddie's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists, then relaxed again. "I tried shelters," he said, his voice low but steady. "Most of them full before I even get in the door. Tried getting work. You know what they tell me?" He mimicked the words, voice dripping with mockery. "Come back when you got a phone. Come back when you got an address. Come back when you got clean clothes." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Like I could pull that out of thin air." Vance nodded slowly, absorbing every word. For a long time, he had seen stories like Eddie's play out in articles, in policy discussions, in statistics. But standing here face to face, it wasn't just a case study. It was real. "So what then?" Vance asked. "You just gave up?" Eddie's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. For a second, Vance thought he had gone too far. But Eddie didn't explode. He just sighed. "You ever been so tired that even hope feels like too much effort?" Vance didn't answer, because deep down he knew what Eddie meant. The conversation wasn't about $1 anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about the moment when a person decides whether or not to keep trying. Vance could feel it. This was that moment for Eddie. And what he said next would either push him further into that darkness or remind him that maybe, just maybe, there was still a way out. Eddie met his gaze. "So what's this better thing you're talking about?" Vance took a slow breath. "A name," he said. "A number." Eddie frowned. "For what?" Vance held out a small, folded piece of paper. "Someone who can help." Eddie didn't reach for it. Not yet. His fingers twitched slightly, but he hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice quiet, uncertain. Vance's answer was simple. "Because someone once did it for me." Eddie squinted at the small folded piece of paper in Vance's hand. His fingers twitched slightly, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. "What's this?" he asked, suspicion lacing his voice. "A name," Vance said. "A number." Eddie huffed, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "For what?" "Another shelter that's full before I even get to the door. Some hotline that's going to put me on hold for an hour just to tell me there's nothing they can do." His words carried a hard edge, the kind that comes from too many dead ends, too many disappointments. Vance didn't flinch. He had seen that look before. The mix of skepticism and exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just lack of sleep. Eddie wasn't just tired. He was tired of hoping. "No," Vance said. "It's someone who actually gives a damn." Eddie studied him carefully, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "And why should I believe that?" For a moment, Vance didn't say anything. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a worn-out business card. Creases running through it, the edges slightly frayed. He held it up between two fingers. "Because I've used it myself." That made Eddie pause. His gaze flickered from the card to Vance's face, as if searching for any sign of dishonesty. "You," he muttered. "Me." Eddie let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "Man, come on. You look like you got it all figured out. You telling me you've been where I am?" Vance's jaw tightened. For a long moment, he considered how much to say, how much to reveal. Finally, he exhaled. "I know what it's like to feel stuck." Eddie folded his arms, waiting. "I know what it's like to look around and wonder how the hell you got here. To wake up one day and realize that every choice, every mistake, every piece of bad luck led you to a place you never thought you'd be. And then to wonder if there's any way out of it." His voice was steady, but there was a weight to his words, the kind that only comes from personal truth. Eddie's smirk faded slightly. He wasn't laughing anymore, because for the first time, he felt like this wasn't just some guy talking down to him. For the first time, he felt like Vance understood. A gust of wind blew through the street, rattling an old plastic bag near the curb. The world around them kept moving, people walking by, cars honking in the distance. But here, in this moment, everything else faded. It was just the two of them, Two men standing in different places in life, but maybe, just maybe, not as different as Eddie had first thought. So, what happened? Eddie finally asked. Vance exhaled through his nose. Someone gave me a shot. Eddie glanced down at the folded paper again. And now you're here, doing the same thing for me? Vance nodded. Yeah. Eddie licked his lips, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. And what if I screw it up? Vance tilted his head. What if you don't? The words landed heavier than Eddie expected, because no one had ever asked him that before. No one had ever suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was another version of his life waiting for him. One where he wasn't just another guy on the street, another statistic, another forgotten name. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to say. His fingers finally moved, slowly reaching for paper. He hesitated for just a second longer. Then he took it, and in that moment, something shifted. For the first time in years, Eddie felt something unfamiliar, something terrifying, but also something real. Hope. Eddie stood there, holding the small folded piece of paper between his fingers, turning it over like he was trying to feel if it was real. He had been handed things before, pamphlets, bus passes, half-hearted opportunities that led nowhere. But this felt different. His thumb ran along the crease in the paper. What if I call this number and it's just another dead end? Vance didn't hesitate. Then you call me. Eddie's eyes snapped up. What? Vance pulled out a pen, flipping over a napkin from his pocket, and scribbled something down. A second number. His number. He held it out. If they don't help you, I will. Eddie hesitated. This wasn't how these things usually went. This wasn't some guy throwing a 20 at him to feel better about himself. This was different. And Eddie wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. Because hope was dangerous. Hope was something he had learned to live without. His fingers twitched. His chest felt tight. Why? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Vance exhaled, stuffing his hands back into his jacket pockets. Because someone once did it for me. Eddie looked down at the napkin, then back up at Vance. And Vance gave a small nod, and it changed everything. Eddie swallowed hard. For the first time in a long time, he let himself consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, this was another trick. That maybe, just maybe, someone actually meant it this time. He took the napkin. He folded it carefully, sliding it into his pocket like it was the most valuable thing he had touched in years. And then, for the first time since this conversation began, he smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't confident. But it was real. Guess I better make that call. Vance nodded, stepping back as Eddie looked at the number one last time. The wind picked up, rustling the loose fabric of his jacket. And then, without another word, Eddie turned and walked away. But something in the air had changed. For the first time in a long time, Eddie wasn't just walking away from something. He was walking toward it.